All right, recording in progress. Love it. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here. We think it's really cool that you all are, kind of doing the quintessential debater, like nerdy thing and giving up part of your winter break to learn about an argument like framework. We love it. We're super excited to talk to you all today about one of our favorite arguments personally. My name is Jasmine Stidham. I am a full-time coach at Michigan State University, and I'm also the co-director of NSD Flagship, which is where I think I recognize some of you all from.
Hello, I'm Nick. I am an assistant debate coach at Montgomery Bell Academy, and I guess also with Michigan State University. So go green.
Woo, go green, go white. And we are here to talk to you all about truth and justice, aka T framework. We only have like an hour and 15. So for some of these slides, we might go through them like a little bit fast, but like don't worry if you have a question, just like write it down, put it in the chat. And we can always like come back to it. And we can like stick around for, at least I can, for like a little bit, later after like our set time if people have additional questions. But for some of these, we might breeze through. Don't be afraid to write down your questions and ask them later. And we'll also pause to like ask for questions. So like, please utilize the chat function. It's super helpful because then it allows either like Nick or I to like type a response to you to save time. And it, just helps us see all the questions that you all have. So with that, let's get started. We're talking about T framework. If I could go ahead and do, no. All right. The first question that we all need to ask ourselves when we're talking about T framework, which is an argument that you read on the negative against affirmatives that do not read a topical plan or ones that do not affirm the resolution, we need to ask ourselves some certain questions about why debate is valuable and why we do it in the first place. I have on here the question at the top that assumes that we all spent 3 weeks at debate camp, and many of you probably did, or you probably will in the future. So I think that example still applies. It's important for you to think about like why do we all decide to give up our weekends throughout the year? Why do we do an activity like debate instead of something like, mock trial, quiz bowl, whatever, whatever options you may have. And part of the reasons that we all do this weird activity probably have nothing to do with the impacts we're going to talk about today, like, for example, procedural fairness. But the reason why we ask you all to take these questions seriously, like why do we do debate? What do we get from debate? Why is it so valuable? Why do we like it? Is because it's just so important for framework. Because if you don't know how to defend the value of debate, and especially the value of like topical debate, then you're going to have a tough time defending T framework in a competitive debate, especially when, a POMO team asks you, like, why do we do debate? Isn't debate bad? And blah, blah, blah. Like, we need to have a confident answer as to why debate is valuable, why it's good. And you want to think about how you can construct an interpretation of debate that allows everyone to garner like all the awesome benefits, while also leaving room for critical approaches for the topic. All right. Framework. The purpose of it is that it's a debate about debate. It's just for all of you LDers, it's a big theory debate, honestly. It's just like a theory debate on steroids, really. It's asking a question like, what is the role of the negative debater when negating an affirmative that does not affirm the resolution, or want an affirmative that, for example, focuses on their identity or on personal narratives, etc. Framework is also about doing this thing that we call establishing a floor, not a ceiling. And what that phrase means, if you haven't heard it before, is that it means that we're establishing a baseline. So we're saying that with our model of debate that we're creating, you can do a lot of things. You can talk about a lot of different issues. You can talk about a lot of issues related to identity, structural violence, etc. But the baseline that all affirmatives must meet is that we need to at least affirm the resolution. And then we can do a whole lot else, like once we get past that baseline. But that's what we mean when we say framework is a floor, not a ceiling. And we're also asking ourselves, like, what would the best possible version of debate look like? Because again, with T framework, we are talking about models of debate, models of debate. But framework is also not about solving the affirmative. This thing will come up more when we talk about topical versions of the affirmative or TVAs. Maybe you all have heard of them. And framework, above all else, is not an excuse to not engage the affirmative whatsoever. And I know that that can sound a little, confusing because part of the premise of framework is that you couldn't predict the affirmative, therefore you couldn't, prepare to negate it. But it's still incredibly important in high level debates to make sure that you are engaging the affirmative on its own terms while going for T framework. And we'll talk more about ways to do that.
Yeah. So the we start with constructing the one in C. Obviously, that's the, where you actually start the debate, but because I think that Jasmine and I both have pretty decently strong opinions about how this might look. And it's a little bit different than how a lot of other people think. So first is that you're always going to start with your interpretation of the kind of keywords of the resolution, right? United States federal government probably should, you'll define whatever the key words are for the actual topic itself. So intellectual property rights and policy. I don't know any of the LD topics, so sorry, I can't tell you any of those, but whatever that big main phrase actually is. Um, Oh, in LD, we might also define ought. I don't really know anything about the word ought, so if Jasmine wants to jump in at some point and talk about that, maybe worthwhile. But, anyways, we need to be able to define what the resolution encompasses in order to be able to say that the affirmative is not an instance of a topical plan that fits under the resolution, right? So we just kind of like base level, got to define our words, got to say, here's what we think the affirmative needs to be doing before we get into the why they should be doing those things. um, Sometimes we are going to read cards with us, sometimes not. So Erickson in 3 is the most common framework card that's read, just like United States federal government should, hypothetical policy action, all that kind of stuff. Um, Sometimes it's worthwhile, sometimes it's not worthwhile. My teams always include it just because it's useful for, again, that kind of baseline. We have an understanding of what the topic is, and you are not meeting that understanding kind of thing. But I think it is important to recognize that, particularly when you're defining words in the 1NC, that it's not worthwhile for you to define every single thing, but rather only the words that really, really matter. Hence things like United States federal government, should, or ought, and then kind of the key words of the resolution itself. Part of this is that it saves time. No one, that's not true. Oftentimes, the team who is not reading a plan is not going to counter define a lot of these words. There are some crucial exceptions to that, but most of the time, their strategy is going to be impact turning framework, and they're going to be like, yeah, we don't meet those things anyways, blah, blah, blah. So it just becomes a waste of time to define every single possible thing. And it is also important because it means you are not defending a whole bunch of extra extraneous things that aren't very important for you, right? So a lot of the way that critical debate operates is by kind of latching onto something that seems initially very small and maybe kind of redundant or irrelevant, but can very quickly become a very central part of the debate if you allow it to happen. And so it's important that you are only defining terms that you are comfortable with and that you're able to defend so that you don't get yourself into those kind of bad situations. I don't know how to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay. Uh, so that means that you are going to want definitions to support your interpretation. You should explicitly say why the affirmative does not meet your interpretation. I think it's worthwhile to kind of say that. Having multiple standards is always a good idea, even if you are likely to only ever want to go for one of those standards. Almost always, those standards are going to end in something like fairness or like education slash clash. There's a lot of different ways you can get to something like fairness or can get to education or clash. But it's worthwhile to have inroads to get to both of those things, even if you're like, no, I'm just a fairness kind of person, or no, I'm just a clash kind of person, because it's, useful for time trade-off reasons. It's useful for being able to cross-apply certain affirmative answers to the impact that you want to go for, things like that. Um, you can jump in and say that if you want, Jasmine.
You're good. I was just putting a little LD note in there.
Okay. All right. Level LD note. Competing interpretations is obviously crucial for any kind of T or framework argument, which is just that, there are maybe multiple ways to define certain words, but the judge should be willing to say, here is the correct way to define the words that we're talking about here. Um, and then for uh, three other pieces. So I am a huge, huge fan of having the topical version in the 1NC. We'll talk more about what this encompasses, what a TVA or a topical version of the app is. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm a huge fan, though, of it being in the 1NC. And I say this because most debaters don't think that they really need to introduce it until the block, which is it's true. You don't need to, right? You could introduce it in the 2NC if you really, really wanted to, but I think it's worthwhile to introduce it into the 1NC so you can take the time to really start developing your argument so that you can kind of put it in the judge's mind early on. I think that it makes your argument a lot stronger, things like that. Um, Oh, I didn't know that. In LD, you have to have the TVA in the 1NC. Okay, cool. I don't know very much about LD as you all are learning as we're going along here. So in LD, you have to have the topical version in the 1NC. In policy, it's not a requirement, um, but it's a good idea too, anyways, and we'll talk more about what those components might look like. Switch side debate or SSD switch side debate just is the basically the argument that the affirmative could read their affirmative as a negative position, right? There's no reason that they necessarily need to be reading it every single debate that they're in. They can garner whatever the benefits of reading it are in half of the debates. And then it's a good idea to have a turns case argument, right? Just that their lack of reading a plan means that engagement is worse, which is bad for whatever it is they want you to care about, or it incentivizes people to read the worst positions, which also is bad for some reason or other, or they deny us becoming effective advocates, which matters for going out and changing things in the real world, things like that. You want
Okay.
to jump in
For
further?
writing your 1NC interp, there are a couple things that you want to avoid. I think Nick already went through most of these, so I'll be kind of quick. But don't read cards unless you absolutely need them. Okay. It's to save time, it's for efficiency, especially in LD, right? You only get one 1NC and one like 2 NR. So like you really have to choose your cards carefully and make them count. Okay. You also want to avoid just being overly generic or saying like nothing about the specific KF like you're debating, right? Otherwise, your judges are just going to tune out. I can promise you that right now. As a judge who judges a bazillion clash debates related to T framework throughout the year, both in LD and like policy, I can confidently say the judges do snooze and tune out when you're being incredibly generic, when you're just doc botting and not actually engaging with the specific 1AC. So you have to make sure that you are talking about the affirmative as much as humanly possible. And this is often really easy, even if you don't understand what the KF is saying. Even if you're like, oh my gosh, this KF is using so many words that like I truly do not understand these 8 syllable words. That's fine. The judge probably doesn't understand all of them either. But what you want to do is that you want to create the perception that you're being specific. And all that takes is just using keywords and phrases that the 1AC is using, right? Because even if you don't know what the radical alterity of nothingness is from the dumb Baudrillard half, it doesn't matter. You can still use those phrases and the app's language into your blocks to show the judge, like, hey, I am trying to engage the affirmative. I am like making my block sound specific. That goes so far. You also want to make sure that you avoid making it sound like you hate KFs, basically. That's like this super simple way to explain this. Don't sound like someone who doesn't care about KFs or someone who thinks they're all like silly and irrelevant. Because A, we shouldn't, homogenize critical debate. Okay. There are good versions and bad versions, just like there are with any arguments, right? But strategically, it's really important that you don't sound like a jerk, when you're talking about critical affirmatives, because then your judge is going to be like, I'm not really vibing with you. And it's probably not good for your speaker points. And it's probably a lot easier for your opponent to point that out, right, in their speeches to be like, see, look at your model of debate is pretty bad and exclusionary because look at how you talk about critical affirmatives. So this is just to, make sure that you are using the proper language, and that you're, at least giving the KF some credit, right? Like you can disagree with it, and go for T framework and win without sounding like you don't care. That's all you want to avoid. Oops. All right, next up here, the resolution. We love it. It's really good. So we're giving this example of like UBI because most of you are like super familiar with like UBI and everything on some level. So that'll be this example. When we are reading T framework, we are saying the resolution is our best friend, okay? And we're specifically talking about the resolutional mechanism. And what that means is that we're talking about the overall function of the resolution, not just like one word like universal or income or basic, because oftentimes the KF will try to do that. The KF will try to counter define one word like universal, and they'll be like, universal is actually this other K thing. And it's like, okay, that's great, but like we're not just talking about the word universal. We're talking about something like a term of art, right? Like a universal basic income. So, terms of art and the resolutional mechanism are really important when we're talking about T framework. The two main reasons why that the resolutional mechanism is a good stasis point is one, we all have the same resolution. We all got it at the same time. Nobody got a head start. Nobody got it first. Nobody, knew it before everyone else. Everyone has the exact same debate topic. Everyone got it at the exact same time. And even in high school, you're able to vote for your topics as a student. So, like, there is like a democratic component of choosing the topic, like, especially for LD, like, you are allowed to vote for the topic that you want to see in the world. And secondly, the resolution is a desirable stasis point because it defines the division of affirmative and negative ground. Whenever we look at a topic, we start to think about which arguments does the AF get, which ones does the neg get. But it's really hard to define that division of AF and neg ground when the affirmative decides to jettison the resolution entirely and decides to say, I'm not being topical, I'm not going to affirm the resolution. Because then, how does AF and neg ground work, right? More on that in a minute once we get to limits. Predictability. We love predictability. Where does predictability stem from? The resolutional mechanism. You will have debates where people will tell you, hey, my AF is predictable. It was on the wiki. Or, come on, this was an AF we cut at camp. So, like, obviously you should be ready. Or, but I disclosed my AF to you 30 minutes before, like, the start time or whatever. None of that cuts the mustard, okay? That's what we call post hoc predictability, which is a bad standard for debate, right? Because by that logic, if I could tell you a year in advance, that I'm going to read an AF that is about giving everybody a golden retriever puppy, and like that is my UBI, that is my personal basic income strategy. And even if I gave you a year in advance to prep, does that make it predictable based on the resolution? No, of course not, right? So all these other things that people are going to say to show that their app is predictable, you need to be like, nope, that is not good enough because anyone can say that. Literally anybody could say it was on the wiki or I disclosed it. And that produces a pretty bad model for debate, right? Because imagine if we just like enacted that as our, holistic model of debate and we didn't have a resolution at all, right? Then everyone could just say, well, yeah, it was on the wiki. So, like, why do you even need a topic beforehand? So, we are saying that we need to hang on to the resolutional mechanism because it is the best locus for predictability and for stasis because people are going to break new arguments right throughout the year. People are going to read new affirmatives, they're going to read new Ks, they're going to read new counterplans and disads, but we will have the resolution. We will have the resolution no matter what because it stays the same and it defines the division of af and neg ground. And predictability is important to think about because it's kind of something that's like embedded throughout every framework argument. Like it's hard to win T framework if you're not prepared to like defend predictability as a concept. And what you're trying to say is that the resolutional mechanism will always be the best stable locus, not the wiki and not anything else, the resolution. Ground. So, oftentimes with critical affirmatives, they will tell you, oh, yeah, there's like a ton of ground that you could get, right? Like there's all this ground you could read against our AF, yada, yada. But when you're negative, you are saying that when an AF is like indirectly related to the resolutional mechanism, it massively undercuts all of your neg ground that you prepared for this topic, right? So like can someone give me an example on the LD wealth tax topic? What's an example of something that is like an LD topic or an LD AF, KF that is indirectly related to the resolutional mechanism? Anybody have one? Want to put one in the chat or raise your hand? Here we go. Like by indirectly, I mean something that's trying to put like a critical spin maybe on the topic wording, but it's not like actually affirming the topic. Oh, bad debt. That's a really good example. And that's a cool AF. I'm not at all trying to diss the bad debt AF, y'all. But the bad debt AF is a KAF. Chupang, would you mind describing either in the chat or unmuting like what that AF is?
I actually don't know
Oh,
because I'm not the one that's reading it.
that's fair, Chubang. It is a good example. So basically, the bad debt AF, to give like a super quick summary, is it has the US adopt a wealth tax on this critical concept called bad debt. Okay. So when you look at that advocacy statement, it looks kind of topical, right? Because it seems like the US is affirming a wealth tax, right? So like it's indirectly topical. That's what I kind of mean, Chris Mo, if that answered your question. So it's an AF that seems like it might be topical, but it's kind of indirectly related to it. But like with that AF that I just described, do all of your topic DAs like apply to it? No. Your process can like no, like because it doesn't actually affirm the resolution. It's indirectly related to it, right? So in that world for the affirmative, they are able to access critical topic literature and they can still though spike out of disads, counterplans, and Ks by being able to say like we don't link to that, we actually just embrace like bad debt or whatever, we do this whole other thing that your cards don't assume, right? And what you're saying as the negative is that we should be able to read core of the topic arguments that are predictable and intrinsic to the US adopting a wealth tax, right? You're like, that's all we're saying. We're like, you can do a lot of K things while still being topical, but we as the negative should be entitled to reading, like the economy DA or, just other basic disads that link to, the core AFs. And you're saying that when the affirmative tips the scale of ground division, so that way it's like higher on the AF side, that means the AF can maximize their research labor and kind of manipulate the balance of prep, right? Because again, it means that they get access to all of this really awesome critical topic literature that they get to prep out and everything. But you over here on the neg don't get to read any of your core generic positions because they just straight up do not apply to this affirmative. Make sense? All right. But they're going to stand up and say, you get all of this ground. You could say cap good, or like you could read a counter poem or something. Or you could read state good or something. Like, yeah, sure. But like those are not usually round winning strategies, right? That's that's like the trick of this is that whenever the affirmative is like, you get all this ground, you get this, you get that, they're usually listing off like the worst two and R's possible against their affirmative, right? Because they're trying to make it seem like, look, we link to things, but again, they're listing off the worst possible positions. So when you answer this argument, when you're negative, you want to say this is concessionary ground. And this is bad because it means that you're at the mercy of the 1AR and LD, right? You are literally at the mercy of whatever the 1AR decides to give you. Because the 1AR is the first time they're going to respond to T framework. And in that speech, they're going to be like, you could read this, you could read that, you could read this. And you're going to be like, well, that doesn't really help me because I have one neg speech left in this debate. So thank you so much. At least in policy, you have a neg block and stuff to kind of recover. But in LD, you don't get that at all. And this type of concessionary ground is bad because it just moots all of your pre-tournament and your pre-round research, right? Because if you cannot predict this topical mechanism, the critical affirmatives, angle, then none of your disads or none of your case turns, like everything that you prep basically just kind of goes away. It just doesn't really help you. And it's also bad for K debates, which I'll save more on that later because that's like a whole slide in and of itself. Before we jump to the next slide, are there any questions about anything we've said so far about predictability, ground, anything like that? All right. Feel free to put it in the chat and one of us will answer if you think of something. But not all ground is created equal, because it's also about the ground that the AF gains with their interpretation. It's not just what you lose, okay? Because as the neg, as we just established, you lose a lot of ground, right? You lose a ton of ground and a ton of arguments, but the AF gains a lot too. It means that they just get access to so much like critical like research that you just like cannot adequately prepare to answer. And it means that the affirmative also prevents in-depth critical debates, which turns their offense because most of the time the KAF is saying that they think we should have more critical debates instead of like policy LARP debates. And so you're saying that well, if the affirmative gains all of this unpredictable ground that I cannot foresee as the negative, then how am I supposed to have a good critical debate with you, if that's what we're supposed to have? Because having any good type of debate requires predicting it and preparation, right? But if the affirmative kind of obviates that, then how are we supposed to have any type of good debate? Now you all should think about, because this will be really important for Clash once we get there, think about the best debates you've had. The best debates you've had. Nick and I will think about the best debates we've ever had too in college. And, when I think about the best debates that I had in college, they were not necessarily all the debates that I won. In fact, many of them I think I lost, but I would still call them the best debates because they were just really hard and good and challenging. And that's because the best debates that we have are usually not the ones where we walk in and like dunk on a novice who's like at their first tournament, right? Like, yeah, that could be a nice confidence booster in the morning, but like it doesn't actually make for a good debate, right? Like you're not actually getting better from those debates when you just get to walk in and like crush your opponent. The best debates are usually the ones that are really clash filled, right? The ones where one team came in, they read an affirmative, and the other side had like a prepped out case neg, and they are like ready to go. They're ready to throw down. Both debaters have practiced this. Those are the best debates to judge, especially. So the reason why I say all of this is because in order for us to have a good clash-filled educational debate, no matter what the topic is, well, the negative needs good, predictable neg ground, right? Otherwise, we're never going to get the best parts of like topic education if one side is, not able to engage. So good ground is always better than generic ground. And the KAF is often offering you generic neg ground. And you are saying that is bad and that we should have topic specific ground because that is better. I don't know, Nick, if you want to talk about limits, I can too. But limits, this is often the best impact and just like the most strategic impact. So like lock in for this one. Because this is where like the KAF really doesn't have any game. And that's because primarily think about the affirmative's counter interpretation. A critical affirmative, their counter interpretation. Is it going to be more limiting than yours or less limiting than your interpretation? It's obviously going to be less limiting than your interpretation, right? Because they're reading a KAF. And so they're saying we need to have more AFs. Like we should have a bigger, more expansive view of the topic. Okay? So the reason why limits is always really strategic to go for when you are negative is because you'll always be ahead. Like factually speaking, you will always be ahead on having a more limited topic. There's no way the affirmative could possibly create like a more limited topic than you, okay? And this is where, like, if you've read a KF, which like I have too, like that like you're never gonna win on limits, so you gotta win on something else. So even the KF team knows that the negative is ahead here. So you're saying that the critical affirmative, they allow anything that is like tangentially or indirectly related to UBI or economic inequality to be topical, right? Because that's often how critical research goes, is that you'll find, an interesting K book and you'll be like, ah, it mentions UBI. It says it right there. I think I found an AF, you guys. And that's often how a lot of KFs are written, right? But that means the research burden for the negative just explodes because there are so many critical ideas in different literature bases. Like any K you could possibly think of would like apply to economic inequality, and every K author probably has something to say about UBI, right? There are far too many critiques of economic inequality and like those policies out there. But there's only one resolutional mechanism which sustains meaningful limits on the topic. And you're saying on the neg that we need limits because it's much better for topic education, it's better for clash, it's better for literally any benefit that we want to get from debate, right? And you're saying too that education, often one of the paradigm issues we talk about in LD, education comes from clash, not just the affirmative speeches. And what I mean by this is that the affirmative team reading a KAF is often like, hey, our AF is super important. We're talking about important issues, and we think this is educational. And oftentimes, like, they're right. Like, they are talking about like important issues that like we all probably should know more about, right? But that doesn't mean that they have created an educational model of debate. That is the difference, right? The speech act of the 1AC, the critical 1AC that they have written is probably educational. You could concede that. You could be like, yeah, your app is super educational and interesting, but that doesn't mean that you have created an educational model of debate. And that's what framework is about. That is what framework is all about, everybody. Education comes from clash, not just the affirmative speeches. It's important you think about what their interpretation would justify. Nick, you should give me like an example, put one like in the chat or something, one that you've heard. So the affirmative is going to have a counter interpretation, right? And you want to think to yourself, what would this interp justify? And this is where you just need to think about regular tea debating. Most of you have probably learned about topicality, right? And how to just debate topicality. The same is true for T framework. It's really not that different. You are going to look at the affirmative's interpretation and you're going to be like, based on this wording, what kind of AFs would this allow and justify? And then you want to explain that. You want to give a case list to the judge. You want to be like, if we allowed this interpretation, here is what debate would look like. It means you could read an AF about this, about this, about this, and this, and this. And you want to give as many examples as possible. Okay. And when it comes to organizationally, where you do limits, you want to put it where you're answering the counterinterp. Why? Because the limits DA is offense against it. The 1AR or the 2AC in policy is going to say counterinterpretation. Our, interp is the affirmative should be able to blah, blah, blah. And then in the 2 and R, you're going to say, nope, limits. There's a limits disad to the affirmative's counterinterpretation. It is unlimiting, it explodes the topic, and would justify so many untopical AFs. Or anti-topical AFs are cool. Yeah. Is that a real interp you've heard recently, Nick?
Basically, it's just
Basically,
like, we should be able to K the topic.
we should be able to.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. Okay. Anyone have ideas? Why don't you get to pick which side you are in every debate?
I'm not sure if this is like the actual warranting as to why, but it's probably good to like have some flex and be able to like look at a topic from both sides or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Like, yeah, there are so many reasons why we don't get to pick which side we are in every debate, right? That would just like break debate. But the reason why we have you all think about this is because it really relates to switch side. Yeah, like Emma, tab will be messed up. Absolutely. Education fairness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could be cracked at only one side of the topic, especially in LD when like there's such a huge skew. Okay, and it's so hard out there to be AF. Can you imagine being like AF in like every LD debate? Like you would lose most, yeah, it would be so hard. It'd be so hard. So there are many reasons why we do not allow ourselves to just pick what side we want to be in every single debate. And primarily because of switch side. It's because we think switch side is like a really good idea, okay? And that it's educational, it's beneficial, and it's one of the main reasons why schools love debate too, because they think the switch side debate is an awesome thing that helps us all become more well-rounded people, etc. So switch side debate is just the expectation that each debater is gonna, argue the AF and the neg side like 50% of the time, okay? Switch side is a structure of debate. It is a part of the model we are creating with T framework, okay? Now there are ways to read switch side as offense and ways to win switch side as defense. So when you're reading it, and by offense defense, I kind of just mean like, you know, when you're going for an offensive argument, you're saying that the AF is like actively like bad, or causes something bad to happen, whereas defense is more like just saying, that the AF is not, or something is not as bad as it seems, etc. It's a little bit different with switch side and like theory debating. So when you're going for switch side as offense, you're kind of going for it as an internal link to clash. More on that later. Nick is going to talk about clash. And then defense, the most common argument that some of you are probably familiar with, is just saying read it on the neg, right? Because most critical affirmatives are also negative critiques. They are critiques of the resolution that could be read just as easily on the negative, right? Because if the affirmative is critiquing like economic policies and stuff, and they're like, we shouldn't do UBI, UBI is evil and all of that, well, guess what? If other teams are reading a UBI AF, they just get to read it on the neg whenever they want. Bada bing, bada boom, easy. But unfortunately, going for switch side is not always that easy. Sometimes it can be harder. But it is an argument that you should almost always include when going for T framework because it doesn't hurt you that much. It doesn't take that long to just be like, hey, you can read this on the neg. We're not saying like that you shouldn't be able to talk about these issues at all. We're just saying like you could just be reading it like on a different side, etc. And like that should probably solve this. And there are also strategic ways to pair switch side debate with the TVA because it allows you to be like, look, if you read the topical version of the affirmative, as the AF, well, then on the neg, we could read this against it. And then here's all the education we would gain from that debate. And then on the negative, so that kind of takes it to the next level. We might get to more of that in a little bit, but this is like the very basics of switch side debate. I'm going to move on to this. All right, this part is really important. And this is where I see a lot of LDers not really, they don't do this as well. Mostly, I think, due to time. I think LDers often feel like they don't have as much time to develop these arguments. So I'll yap about them for a minute here. Debate is a game. This block is really important to write and to win if you want to win procedural fairness as your primary T framework impact, okay? There's so many things that make debate a game. Like, for example, there is literally a winner and a loser in every single debate. Like, unless there's a forfeit or something else happens, there is a winner and a loser in every debate. There is a judge, a referee who decides the debate. There are rules in debate, right? Like there are rules based on, the amount of prep time you have. There are rules against things like clipping. There's so many rules for like, oh my gosh, just like debate leagues and formats and all sorts of things, right? Like if you're in Texas, shout out TFA, you probably know that the TFA Constitution is like 12 miles long because we do have rules in debate, even though a lot of people like to say we don't have rules in debate. And there are trophies, there are speaker points, there are algorithms that decide, brackets and all sorts of things. Like there's so much about our activity that makes it a game, right? And if it's not a game, then like what is it? Like honestly, I don't know. A fun academic activity, maybe, but there's still a winner and a loser, right? Like that's what makes this different from other academic activities. And if it's not a game, then what's the role of the judge? And if it's not a game, why do both sides care about strategy and winning and losing, right? Like, why do we care so much about winning if it's not a game? How can our arguments be resolved at the end of the debate by a judge if it's not a game, right? So I think when you're negative and you're going for T framework, you want to say, and you want to kind of use some of the examples that I gave earlier, you want to explain why debate is a game, why it is intrinsic to the activity, and why that matters for the purposes of procedural fairness. Because if debate is factually a game, and if you win that the affirmative has made the game much easier for them to win, and they have skewed competitive equity, then it makes it easier for you to win that procedural fairness should matter. But if you don't do this part, if you don't win that debate as a game, then it kind of undercuts a big premise that you need. Like basically debate as a game is like, the it's like your ontology argument as the negative, essentially, when you're going for T framework. Like you're like this is your ontology argument, that debate as a game. The affirmatives perspective. So critical affirmatives will answer this argument in a variety of ways. Some will say, yeah, they'll just flat out disagree. Some of them will be like, debate is not a game. Like, how dare you even say that? Like, no, it's not. Bleh. Like, they just really disagree. Most of the time, they are going to say, yes, it is a game. You're right. But it's also more than that. It's also more than that, and it's bad to assume that everyone debates for the same reasons or blah, 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 right? Like, or they might say, yes, but we want to win for different reasons. Like, we want to win for like representation reasons or, for something else that is like, important to us, etc. So most chaos take this approach where they're like, yeah, we kind of agree debate is a game, but it's not just a game. Like, it's not just X's and O's, right? Or sometimes they'll be like, yeah, like it's a game, but like, there's not a rule that says we have to be topical. And like they're right about that. Like there's not like, like I don't have to necessarily like, blow the whistle or like call tab as soon as someone reads a critical affirmative. But that doesn't mean that it's still not a norm, right? An expected norm to affirm the resolution, which is what we are saying on the negative. So that's like the TLDR on the AF's perspective. Nick, do you have any thoughts here on the AF's perspective and how they approach this?
I find the most persuasive response to the fairness impact from the affirmative just kind of like, or sorry, when I say fairness debate is a game kind of thing, it's just like that is a terrible way to think about this. Just straight up impact turning it
Mhm.
kind of thing, and then the the offensive approach I think is the most persuasive because the defensive arguments are just like wrong. It's like obviously debate is, more than just a game or, the other kinds of pieces that Jasmine's talking about here, but all those things kind of devolve into debate being a game itself, or require the affirmative to cede the negatives argument to them. And so I think that the most persuasive answer is just like, no, it's not a game, or you should artificially separate yourself and assume that it's not a game because of the race war or the war in Palestine or, what other thesis claim that the affirmative is presenting. Um, but I would for sure echo what Jasmine's saying that if you win that debate as a game, then I think that resolves a lot of what you are trying to prove and negates a lot of what the affirmative is saying.
Mm-hmm. All right, defending procedural fairness, my favorite impact. The first is that you must prioritize your internal links first. Now, internal links are things that we've already talked about. So, like ground, predictability, limits, etc. Soon we're also going to talk about clash in a way that also is an internal link, but all of those things that I just mentioned are internal links to fairness, right? And they matter more than just defending fairness in the abstract, right? It doesn't really help you to stand up in your 2 and R in LD to be like, fairness is the most important thing in debate, and like that is my speech. Because we care more about like limits and ground and predictability. So focus more of your time on developing those arguments and making those arguments sound super specific to the affirmative, right? This is what we talked about when it comes to like giving caseless examples for limits and what the affirmative's interpretation would justify. Like all of those things sound a lot more persuasive to most judges than just a generic, like procedural fairness comes first block. Now, do you need to win that procedural fairness does in fact come first? Yes. But I say all these things at the top to, get you all to realize that procedural fairness, like winning it, only matters if you've done the other things first. Okay? So, like, prioritize the other stuff. It's the cherry on top. There are different ways to explain why procedural fairness matters. The first could be just like game preservation. Like there is no game of debate. Like there is like our activity does not exist in the way that it needs to, if we do not maintain some level of procedural fairness. It's a necessary metric of evaluation. This next one is super simple, and I think all of you should probably adopt this. Unfair AFs shouldn't win. Like I know this is why they pay me the big bucks, but like unfair AFs shouldn't win. And this argument is especially useful in rounds where the AF is like, okay, but I'm not gonna stop reading my KF, or like, do you think that like you're gonna delete all KFs from the topic? Your answer is going to be, well, like, no, I probably can't like force everyone else to stop reading arguments. But my point is that in this debate, you skewed the debate by being not topical. That skewed competitive equity, which means you shouldn't win, and like I should win. It's so simple. Like you don't have to overthink it. And then the third one is like deterrence, right? It's like you could also say like, well, sure, maybe I can't prevent every other KF from being read, but like it probably deters some of them, right? Like if judges are voting like on T framework a lot, I'm sure KFs are going to be like, oh, maybe I should read a plan, or maybe I should, find a way to be more topical, right? Deterrence, of course. Competitive incentives. You also, another argument you could throw in there, I don't have it on the slide, but most of you probably are familiar with this, the fairness paradox. Someone explain, what is the fairness paradox? Anyone? You typing it out? I hear the fairness paradox all the time. Oh, okay, fair enough. Oh, that's right. That was a debate. Okay. So fairness paradox. I don't know, Nick, do you wanna take a crack at it? You want me to? Doesn't matter to me.
Yep, then. Um, as I understand it, it's basically that the affirmative, believe it or not, despite that they're not reading a plan, despite that they claim, that fairness just is bad or doesn't matter or is messed up in some way, the affirmative needs fairness too, right? They expect the judge to fairly evaluate their arguments. They expect the judge to be flowing and to evaluate line by line or kind of technical concessions in much the same way that every other team does. They expect the judge to fairly or uh, fair, the word fair kind of slides a bunch to mean a lot of different things in this instance, but they also expect the judge to fairly evaluate arguments, right? They expect them to kind of approach the F's arguments with an open mind and to kind of be willing to listen to it and vote on it, even if they don't agree with it, kind of thing. And so, what becomes weird with the K teams not reading a plan and saying fairness is bad is that all the time that they're saying this, they also kind of need fairness in some sense. And
Yeah.
so that's a pretty good defense of procedural fairness is like, look, you also want procedural fairness, right? You're talking about it in different words and you're thinking about it in a slightly different form than what the negative is saying. But if it's true that the affirmative doesn't need to defend a plan or doesn't need to defend the resolution, then why do we need to use any other norm or rule in debate at all, right? Why wouldn't we just break all of those things? Why wouldn't the judge just vote negative to vote negative or vote negative because they think that the negative is right? Or like, I want the neg to win every debate. Like, if I'm your judge, you should say the neg should win every debate. And like, I'll be like, yeah, you're right. The neg should win every debate. Why wouldn't the judge just arbitrarily do that? Fairness.
Yep. Fairness paradox, right? Like we all kind of want fairness too. And for the KF, guess what? They also have to be neg against KFs too, right? Like it's like sometimes we forget about this when we're talking about like switch side and the fairness paradox, but definitely add this to your blocks. It's like everyone has to go neg at some point, right? And like it's easy when you're reading the KF and you can be like, yeah, like who cares about it when you're neg? It's like, but in like an hour, you could get the text that says you're neg against a KF that you don't have a case neg to, and you're going to see just how hard it is to be neg against those Fs, right? So the fairness paradox also applies in that way. For the last subpoint here, why does procedural fairness come before the AF's like education first framing? Because that is typically what the AF says, that education has to happen first, has to be prioritized rather. And as we established on some earlier slides, remember that education doesn't just come from the AF speeches. Like education isn't just a question of was the AFs like was the 1AC educational? Did I learn something? Of course you did. You probably did learn something. But we're talking about models of debate and whether or not they are educational for both sides. And in order for a model to be educational, the other side has to be able to predict it. They have to have good ground and good prep and good, a good 1NC against it. Okay, structural unfairness. This is an argument that pops up in like every single like K debate. So lock in for this one. So the affirmative will say that things are structurally unfair in society and in debate for a lot of reasons. Gender, race, disability, like there's so many different ways we could talk about this. And here's the thing, they're probably right. They're probably right that like our society is structurally racist and sexist and ableist and all the bad things. And like debate also has a lot of that baggage too, right? Like debate can be super exclusionary in a lot of ways. Absolutely. As the neg team, you're not going to stand up and say, actually, things are perfectly fine in debate and society. Why are you complaining? We're never going to say that, right? So this is what I mean when I say you don't have to disagree with the AF's uniqueness claims. We can agree that structural unfairness does exist in a lot of ways, but what does that have to do with the resolution? Right? So when people stand up in their AF speeches and they talk about the things that make debate like structurally unfair, what are they talking about? They're usually saying things like, oh, like there's often a lot of like interpersonal racism in debate, right? Like coaches or judges or, opponents like saying messed up things, or maybe they're talking about, the treatment of like, women in society and how women are often like not believe, they could be talking about so many things that are probably 100% true, but what does that have to do with like the US ought to adopt a wealth tax? This is where 99% of K teams do not like pass this test, is that they do not connect their structural fairness arguments to the resolution, right? And this like really matters because if there's no link between structural unfairness and reading a plan, then why can't the AF just read a plan, right? It shows that it's like entirely disconnected from the offense they're going for. So as the negative, you are saying, yes, I agree with you, like AF team, all of these issues like do exist in debate, but none of those are connected to whether or not like you read a plan or not. It seems like a lot of the things you're talking about would actually be better solved by doing other things outside of round, even to make debate a more inclusive space. Like, for example, hosting this wonderful like workshop that is free and available to like all students, right? Like, there are a lot of things we can do in debate to make it more accessible, to make it more safe. But I don't think those things have anything to do with like the resolutional wording, right? So that's what you're saying is the neg. You're also saying, is the ballot the best way to resolve it? Like, for example, if the AF team is talking about like, interpersonal racism that exists in debate, well, me voting AF or neg does not, unfortunately, it does not do anything to change that. I wish it did. I wish it was that easy. I wish I could delete all of the isms like by just voting AF or neg. It'd make all of our lives so much better. But that's not how debate works, right? So as the negative, you also want to be making arguments about the ballot and how the ballot cannot necessarily resolve these things either. Okay. And Nick.
Sorry, my screen was being weird. Okay, so Jasmine's talked a lot about the I'm kind of with her. I think it's the most persuasive impact is kind of a fairness push. But if you're not someone who's very persuaded by fairness, I think a topic education or a clash argument might be useful to consider going for. So the first thing we really want to ask ourselves when we are debating against a K team is how is education actually garnered in debate? And this is something that Jasmine's already kind of talked a lot about, which is that it's not just the reading of the 1AC, right? It's not just listening to an affirmative team talk about some problems in the world and a potential solution to that problem, to that or those problems, but it is actually to engage in dialogue and deliberation over the merits of that problem and how we might go about resolving that problem. Okay. And that's really what we mean when we say the word clash. It's just like, are we debating over a topic? Are we, kind of going head to head against each other about whatever it is that we're talking about? And are we kind of getting into depth about those topics and abilities to ways to resolve them, what the merits of how we might understand them are, things like that. One of the things that we've written here is this idea of process over product, which I think is a beneficial thing to consider when we're thinking about clash as an impact and as a value to debate, is that it's the process of being able to talk about a whole bunch of different things and kind of get really, really detailed about those things that makes debate really valuable. That's why, you know, a bunch of schools like having their debate team, why you as students get a lot better in school and at writing and at thinking on your feet in debate. It's not because, you've listened to several different KAFs talk about some problems in the world and then ramble about some philosophical, complicated, structural ways of dealing with problems in the world. It's because you've engaged in this process of forcing yourself to get really, really in depth on a certain topic, right? And so the process of debating, of clashing, matters a lot, and certainly matters more than whatever the thing is that is being debated over. That then means that the details matter and the process of analyzing outcomes is really, really important, right? All we're not all going to be policymakers, obviously. That's the K team is correct about that we are not going to grow up to become the next senator or president or whatever. Like we're just not. I don't know. Maybe one of you will. That would be really cool if I could look back in 15 or 20 years and be like, hey, I gave the president a lecture on framework. But like that's probably not going to happen. And that's okay. I guess Jasmine's going to lead the Doge department. Good for her. Other than Jasmine, though, probably not going to happen. And that's okay because we still need to analyze outcomes in order to be able to survive in our day-to-day lives, right? In order to develop the critical thinking skills necessary to make us the best versions of ourselves, in order to, you know, figure out solutions in the immediate term, the things that we have to do on our day-to-day basis, like being able to rapidly how do I word this? Rapidly process information and think things through to the logical extreme and kind of get through all of the pieces of something is so very important just for us to be able to survive, just for us to be able to do the things that we want to do. And that is both an impact in and of itself. And I'm kind of jumping ahead a slide or two here, but whatever. I'm on a roll. We're going with it. It's a huge straight turn to the case. Just like huge, the biggest straight turn you can possibly imagine, right? Like all these K teams want to think of themselves as so radically revolutionary and so like, yeah, man, we're gonna overthrow the state and we're gonna make the world such a better place. But if we can't think about how we get to that conclusion, how we do things like revolt or create some kind of change in some way, then that's not really all that useful, right? There's about a million different examples of failed revolutions and revolts and instances of change where people just kind of tried to do something, but they didn't really think it through. And so were unsuccessful at alleviating the violences that they were talking about. So actually, great that you brought up capitalism. That's literally where I was about to go, is the Occupy Wall Street movement of the late 2000s, early 2010s is an excellent example, right? There were hundreds of people who kind of camped out in um, Central Park in New York City. They, had this big old criticism of Wall Street where like it's this evil organization, it's got to be taken down. And that was kind of as far as they went. They were like, we got to take it down. And the problem then became that because no one had tactics for figuring out how to take down Wall Street, it became really easy for those people to just kind of give up or for it to kind of just peter out and not be really all that successful, right? And so, I mean, people know a lot more about why Wall Street is evil now, but I don't really know that we needed Occupy Wall Street for us to tell us that Wall Street was evil. And so it's important for us to be willing to get into the very, very in-depth details of solutions or advocacies or different isms for us to understand how they function and how we might do things about them. Um, so we need to be able to clash with the AF, right? We need to be able to predictably prepare for whatever it is that the other team is, or for whatever the topic is, excuse me, and research it, right? And kind of get into why this kind of stuff matters a lot. Um, and this is kind of similar to something that Jasmine was talking about before, and kind of jumping back to the counter-interp I mentioned before of this like Rev v. Rev debate kind of thing, because most K teams will want to respond to this kind of argument by saying, well, we facilitate those debates better because we say, here's a revolution, you have a different revolution. It's your job to say that that revolution is better than our revolution or something like that. The problem is that the way that those debates go down in the world where we don't have a kind of stasis point that's grounded in a predictable revolution. Oh, sorry. Thank you for saying that, Jasmine. When we say Rev v. Rev, we mean KVK debate. This is the kind of cool, hip way of saying it now is we're revolting. We have different revolutions, whatever. Though that's not how debates in the real world work. It's just like it's not. It's people, revolutionaries, people who are like, I actually want to commit myself to creating change in the world, are not like, well, it's either I revolt against capitalism or I revolt against anti-blackness or something. Like that's moronic. It's just like baffling that anyone in debate thinks that that's how things work because it's not, because instead people who really join social movements and advocacy groups are taking the time to learn the intricacies of what it is that they are opposing and how they might go about trying to resolve those things. This is the same thing with academics, right? Is academics don't really it happens. It's rare that academics will on point disagree with each other in the way that debate requires, right? So I think about this a lot with Afro-pessimism in particular because it's becoming a lot more prevalent in my field. I have a PhD in communication studies, rhetoric stuff, and so Afro-pessimism is becoming more and more common. Even the people in my field that I know of, at least, who largely disagree with Afro-pessimism as a theory, don't ever approach it from the perspective of like, no, this is wrong, right? They're not going to go and read a Wilderson book and then write an article that's like, Wilderson's a moron. We should not listen to anything that he has to say or anything like that. No, instead, they because academia is more of a yes and kind of thing, right? They're gonna read that red, white, and black and think, oh, I thought this part was really interesting, and this part I thought really made me think about this other thing, and I think could help me further investigate this question that I'm interested in, right? No one approaches things in the way that we do in debate, where it's like yes, no, yes, affirmative, no, not affirmative, right? And so to suggest that anyone in the real world engages with each other in the way that these that non-topical models of debate necessitate, where the affirmative says, hey, it's Afro-pessimism, and the negative is like, no, actually it's always capitalism, is like just stupid. Like I'm sorry, it's just there's no other way to put it. It's just dumb. It's dumb. It's not, no one says that. And so I ramble about that for a second, both because I think it's important to recognize that the education and clash kind of arguments that you're forwarding are a great way to straight turn the AF, but also to say that we do, I guess I'm about to repeat myself. I was going to say we do the kind of thing that the AF wants us to do better than they do, which is basically just saying straight turning the AF. Okay, sorry. I rambled about that for a hot second. Do we want to stop and ask questions, Jasmine, or should we talk about topic education, or where do we think we should go from here? Other than a picture of Rai, that's very important.
So to be like, obviously, we have to get to the picture of my cat. Hello, everybody. This is Raymond. As you can tell, she's very angry with me in this photo. But one other slide I do think we should talk about, because this comes up in like every single K debate that I've ever judged in high school, and it's just becoming more of a thing. And you all can like steal this block if you want. You can have it. So ethical subject formation, or just subject formation, as the kids say. This comes up in like every K debate, whether it's like you're debating a KF or just a regular K, whatever. It comes up a lot, right? And I want you all to start thinking about this from a more nuanced perspective. And I want you to please stop reading the most generic version of this slide in this argument in response to ethical subject formation. When we say ethical subject formation, Nick could probably like say more smart things about this because he's an actual like academic who has read these things. But in debate, it basically just means like how good of a person you are. It's just like, are we becoming good ethical subjects and good people, or are we becoming bad people? And in debate, we associate our subject formation and how ethical it is with the types of arguments that we read. And the most common response to this is for people to be like, it's not just debate, it's actually our family and our friends and our schools and our religion. And I hear that same sentence like at every tournament like 20 times. And that's fine. But this is where we need to unpack what we're saying with that very generic sentence, right? Because the KAF team is going to say that we need to vote affirmative for their model of debate because it's for ethical subject formation, and this is how we all become better people. But as the negative, what you are saying is that the process of debate outweighs the content of individual rounds, right? Like nobody is going to leave one debate or even like two debates being like, wow, that just changed my entire life. I'm literally dropping everything and I'm gonna like all of a sudden join this revolution because I was so persuaded by this untopical like affirmative. That just is not how it works, right? And I want us all to, on a more serious note, I don't like when debaters associate like moral goodness or badness with the types of arguments that we read. This is something that is just like has got to go out of style before I pull my hair out, because you could read the letter K your entire debate career, like middle school through college, and you could still leave debate being a really bad person, like a really bad, awful person. There is nothing about like reading the K that automatically makes you a good person. And same with the flip side. Like you could be someone, like I have known people who have literally only gone for like neocon arguments in debate, but they turn out to be like the most ethical people you've ever met in debate because, they were just reading those arguments like for fun in debate because it's debate. And yeah, because there are other things that have shaped them outside of just, the activity of debate. So this is just a rant, a way of saying that the types of arguments you read do not, have anything to say about whether or not you're a good person or a bad person. Individual rounds don't determine those things, but you know what does? Like clash. Like I can certainly think about K debates that I had in college where like my world was rocked, where I was like, wow, I just like kind of got. I just like lost really hard. And, I learned something from that debate. Did it change my entire worldview? Did it like totally put me on a different life path? No. But I can say that there have been rounds that have really made me think a little bit differently, right? But this is so like that can still be true, but it doesn't mean that, the types of arguments that you read or engage in, they do not determine whether or not you're an ethical person or like a bad person. I've known, Nick and I could name a million K debaters who have gone on to be like extremely evil people, like genuinely like scum of the earth evil, and they only read the K their entire lives. So like that happens. That happens more than you think. So that's like a true thing. Feel free to throw that in your box, but yeah. Ethical subject formation comes up quite a bit in debates, and there's a better way to answer it than just saying family, friends, religion, schools. There's more to unpack there. Okay, so that is officially 2:45. We do have, other slides and stuff about, TVAs and all of that, so we'll stick around to answer some questions. But yeah, thank you all for attending. This has been really fun. Questions?
Okay, I just have like a one question basically, because I've been multitasking. I guess like what do you think are I've never read T framework and I've just stayed away from it because it's just a bunch of scary words that nobody's ever covered and I just read Kant, so I don't really care.
Real.
Um, but I think T framework would be fun to do. Like if let's say I was gonna try and write one, I know you covered it a lot in the beginning, but like what are the things that I should definitely write out slash like have? Just so I can
So
go with the list.
yeah, so I can actually just go back to that slide one moment to the thing. Come on, there it is. This is like your one
Okay.
and C checklist. So you want your definitions, just like a regular T shell. Then you want your AF specific violation. So that's where you just say like the AF violates this because, they do this critical thing instead of the resolution. And then you want to write out your standards. So like ground, limits, predictability. And then you want to write out your paradigm issues. So like, fairness, education,
Mhm.
clash, and all of that. You do want to have a competing interps argument. And then you definitely want to have a TVA if you can in the 1NC. Because like in LD, we can't wait until the 2 and R for that. And switch side as well is good to include in there. And then for offense, a clear like turns case argument about how your model of debate is like kind of better for solving some of the issues that the AF is talking about. Sometimes that can be hard to find, like especially like, right before a round when you just have, a few minutes of prep, but that would be ideal to have.
Okay, fire. Thank you so much. I joined late, so I didn't see that.
Other questions?
I had a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I know you talked a little bit about like picking parts from the AF and like creating clash like within the AF. Is there like a specific like list of places that is the best to kind of find those areas? Like you talked about like write out a case list of like what we could have potentially debated if the AF was resolutional, but is there like anything else?
Yes, I love this question because I like go over it with my college debaters like every tournament. So you probably have some pre-written blocks, right? Like you probably have some like pre-written like framework blocks. Is that true? Is that
Um, yeah, sure,
okay?
yeah.
So
It's
like you
very
probably
simple.
like yeah, like some that are like debate as a game or like maybe you have a big block as to why like fairness outweighs everything. So
Mhm.
what I invite you to do is when you're going through like those big generic blocks that you have, there are probably moments in those blocks where you're referring to the AF as being like the AF or like their offense or their impact turns. So put those in like those phrases in brackets and like highlight them So that way, you know, in the debate or like in the pre-round when you're prepping, that that's where you add your AF specific like references. Like any time where you're like referencing the idea of the AF in your speech, try to like just say what it is. You could be like, you know, bad debt, you know, just like using the title of the AF even creates an illusion for the judge that you are like being more specific, and using like language from their impact turns. So like, for example, maybe they have a disad on framework that's like, oh, this is the sacrifice zones DA or something. You could be like, and this, you know, outweighs the sacrifice zones DA, even if like you don't really know what that DA is. The point is just to use their language as much as you can and to integrate it into those parts of your blocks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So you said like in the blocks of like where it says debate is a game and fairness outweighs, is there any other one?
Just like really any of them, honestly. So like any
Okay.
yeah, like any pre-written blocks you have where you're just like referencing the AF or like their offense or whatever, those are the places where I'd be like, okay, highlight that, put it in brackets so that way that's a visual cue for you to be like, oh, this is where I need to like say something about the actual AF, you know?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have three questions if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One is like what to read with T framework, and then two like two and R's on T framework, and then three is forming TVAs.
Love that. Nick, do you have thoughts on the first one for the first question?
Yeah, I am very much a 2N and I'm very much of the opinion that the negative should be able to do almost anything that it wants to do. And so to me, I think it's fine to read any other position that you possibly might want to go for. So, when I was a debater, almost exclusively read some form of Marxism with my framework arguments. I coach my debaters now. They read the ballot pick very frequently. They'll read like institutions kind of disadvantage. They sometimes will read like psychoanalysis or they'll read some kind of Marxism thing. The only thing you need to think about with what else to read with framework is to make sure that you feel comfortable saying those positions together and feel comfortable defending yourself when the affirmative inevitably stands up and reads some kind of critical condo or performative contradictions, which I put in quotations because that word doesn't mean anything, kind of argument, or, when they basically say, like, no, you are not allowed to read framework with this other thing. So as long as you're willing to think that stuff through, I think it's fine. Bye, Alex. Hope that you learned a lot from this. Um, what Jasmine's saying here is also correct, which is that, right, what's the app gonna do? Say that it's unfair that you did this? Like, whatever, man. Like, it, that kind of proves your point. Framework's also a prior question to everything else because it's about whether you could have had the debate in the first place. And so it becomes easier to kind of put that stuff together. In terms of your second question about going for framework, honestly, I don't think there's an answer to this that's very different than any other thing that you might go for on the negative, which is, you want to have some kind of framing issue or piece through which you can filter everything else and explain that that's why you should win the debate independent of everything else, or that it is prior to whatever the other team says, all that kind of stuff, and then do line by line. Line by line's great. We should keep doing it. Everyone should be doing line by line. Even if you're a K team, you should be doing line by line. It's so good. God, line by line's incredible. It's just the greatest invention in debate. I don't know. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Jasmine, other than me just rambling about line
Yeah.
by line.
I was also gonna say, like, LDers, I love y'all so much. Like, please know this comes from a loving place, but we gotta stop doc botting when it comes to T framework. And policy kids do this too. Like, do not get me wrong, but based on the rounds that I have judged recently, like, it is like just cranked up to a max in LD because I think a lot of like prep group coaches just like give these prepped out like docs to their students and they're like, go. And so there's like no engagement. So the best way that you can become like an absolute god at like framework is by writing your own blocks. Like that is like truly the thing. Like that is the secret sauce. There's no other secret recipe. Write your own framework blocks. Get really good at it. Try. It's hard. I remember writing my own framework file from scratch in college because like I didn't have any teammates who did that before me. And so it was really hard. Some of my blocks were bad at first, and then they got a lot better through practice. But that's kind of why I ended up becoming so confident going for a framework and just like didn't really need to think about it that much because I just did it myself and just like gained all of that like confidence and knowledge from just like knowing the file, like front and back. So like writing your own framework blocks boosts your confidence, makes your block sound more like you, and it just makes you more confident like answering CX questions. I think they also asked about T versions, and yes, we can talk about that for a minute. So the general purpose of a TVA, it's to capture the AF's offense, right? It's to say, hey, here's how you could do like your K thing while also being topical, right? It's kind of a TKO, and it proves that there's no mutual exclusivity with defending a plan and being critical, right? You're saying that, hey, AF, you could read like a framing page that critiques debate and extinction impacts and nuclear war impacts. You could K the heck out of all these things while also reading a topical plan that still affirms the resolution with a critical spin, right? That's kind of one of the awesome things about LD, and what I like about LD more is that like we do take seriously like soft left AFs and like AFs that have structural violence impacts. Like in policy, it's harder to win with those. Like most people are like, who cares? But in LD, like we tend to win with those more. So I would talk about that as your TVA. Describe the TVA as a soft left AF. You can be like, look, you can criticize debate for the way that we evaluate impacts in debate. You can talk about all these other things within the debate community and the topic, etc., on a framing page while still reading a topical plan. And here are some other ones. And yeah, I'll share the slides and stuff. Other questions?
One thing I'll add to the TVA thing is that if you are very good at the topical version, i.e., at explaining what it actually is and getting into the details and nuances of it and what the affirmative might say, what the negative might say, how the affirmative might be, just like really painting that picture, I think you can make the topical version offense and not just defense, which is to say that when the affirmative does not defend a model of debate whereby the app is expected to read something like the topical version, they foreclose that as a opportunity. It's an opportunity cost to their model of debate, and so your topical version, if it is such a cool, neat idea, could basically be a DA to the app as well.
Yep, 100%.
Mhm.
Other questions?
I have a question. It might be like Loki kind of like a little dumb,
That's okay.
but kind of like how like sometimes I have trouble telling between what is like a 100% chaos and what is kind of like a topical like soft left app like you're talking about. Is there like a way to like like completely identify it? Because sometimes I feel like they still like affirm like the topic or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's actually a good question. That is not dumb at all, especially in LD. Like that is a line that becomes harder to tell sometimes. So I would say that if the affirmative derives offense, like from the resolutional mechanism, then it's probably just a soft left AF. So, for example, if I read a wealth tax AF that was like, contention one is like neoliberalism is evil or something, and I read a bunch of cards about how billionaires are the worst and like we need to like tax billionaires and like all of that, right? Like that's a soft left AF. And then I would probably have a framing page that's like cap is bad, cap is unsustainable, but like all of my offense derives though, right, from taxing the billionaires and from adopting the resolution. Whereas KAFs, they don't derive their offense from adopting the resolution. They often derive it from their performance, or from just like rejecting the resolution and affirming like a social movement or some other like fun K thing, right? And that can look like a lot of things. So with KAFs, it's important like when you first like get the pairing and you're like, okay, I'm neg against this app, it looks kind of K. Go try to find their advocacy statement. Like even like 90% of KFs will still have one where they say what they do affirm because they might not affirm the resolution, but their advocacy statement will tell you what they do affirm. And if it's clear that they're not getting offense from like taxing the billionaires or whatever, then it's probably just like a straight up KF that is rejecting the resolution. And then the last tip I'll give you is just by like reading their tags carefully. Because with KFs, they usually are not mincing words and they usually are like the resolution is bad. It sucks. Like the resolution is gendered or it is, racist. Like, and so if that's what they're saying, then that's usually a sign like, okay, they are critiquing the resolution. They are not affirming it. No offense will be derived from it.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Other questions? Okay. If there are no other questions, we will go ahead and wrap up, and I will make sure I get these slides to the Win Slack somehow. Thank you all so much for attending and for being our late stragglers. It was awesome interacting with you all. And yeah, very excited to do this. I'm giving another lecture on Sunday. I'm switching sides on Sunday, and we're going to talk about how to K, fun fact. So I might see some of you there. But hope you all have a good Friday night and a good weekend. Farewell.
Hi, y'all.
Thank you,
Bye. Thank
Jasmine.
you.
Have a great day.
All right. Let me.